Good morning. It's good to be here at Uchee Pines again. It's been, I think we were figuring 7 years since we've been here. And we have very good memories of our time here. And this Uchee Pines, well, maybe I should save that for tonight. Maybe, yeah. So we'll wait on that. So before we get started, I just want to give a couple things. Number one, this is kind of a last minute thing because we were asked to come and talk about true education and not so much about the practical nuts and bolts of agriculture, but we were getting some feedback from people saying they wanted to know more practical information. So we kind of threw this together at the last, and even though we have 2 hours or a little over, I hope you understand that there's a lot of information to learn about agriculture. And so I don't know where all of you are, whether you're taking your first baby steps or if you're proficient gardeners and just trying to learn a few more tips. So we're going to kind of try to start at the basics. And the last thing I would just say is that there are no experts in the area of agriculture. And the reason why is because there are no 2 years that are the same. And so it's very hard to well, let me just put it this way. We have a music teacher here. How many times do you need to go over a song in order to master it? A lot. I mean, can you put a number on that? Mastery. We're talking about mastery, being an expert at playing a song. Hundreds of hours. So that would be thousands of times over a particular song. So we've been farming for 22 years. That seems like a long time, right? You would think you would be an expert after 22 years. But think about it this way, we've only had 22 springs. We've only had 22 cycles of growing. Can you be an expert with 22 cycles? I don't think so. So I'm just a fellow pilgrim on the journey. I may be ahead of you because I've had 22 years under my belt, but I don't know it all for sure. But I do want to share some of the things that the Lord has been teaching us, and hopefully you'll gain some practical tips. So the way we're going to try to do this is we're going to have, I want to be a little bit flexible, see how you all, if everybody's nodding off, we may end early and get outside so you can exercise some. We do plan to go to the garden to demonstrate some tools and things, but it's a little bit difficult because it's not my garden. You know what I'm saying? So I don't want to, I just got here last night. I talked to Christian a little bit this morning, but I don't want to be stepping on anybody else's toes. So we're just going to do some demonstration out there. We can talk about things. I want to leave lots of time for questions and answers. So that's kind of the way it's going to flow. We're going to go through a set presentation, these 7 keys to successful agriculture. Then probably next go to the garden, and then depending on how that goes, we can either have Q&A out there or come back here. And I'm happy to answer questions till the lunch bell rings. So, okay, with that in mind, let's pray. Our dear Heavenly Father, it's a privilege and a blessing to be here today. And Lord, we know that you created the first garden, and you placed man there to tend and keep it. And so we know that you are the master gardener. So I pray that we can learn from you first and foremost, but that something I say will be an encouragement and help these who are listening to be able to go forward in their knowledge and ability. This I pray in Jesus' name. Amen. Can you all see those slides? It's a little small. But this is the quote that pushed us into farming as a career. As my wife, those of you who are here this morning, my wife shared how we quit our teaching job and we didn't know what we were going to do next. We just knew that this wasn't meeting our needs. And it took us quite some time, mostly because we were scared to take the step of getting involved in agriculture. But when I read this quote, I couldn't go back. It says, in God's plan for Israel, every family had a home on the land with sufficient ground for tilling. Thus were provided both the means and the incentive for a useful, industrious, and self-supporting life. And very few other plans have ever improved upon that. What was that? Okay, sorry, I misread it. No devising of men has ever improved upon that plan. So that means that after 6,000 years of men's trying to improve and trying to come up with all kinds of modern inventions to make our life better, still inspiration says God's original plan of living in a garden, working the garden, is still the best plan. No devising of man has ever improved on that. So I read that and it's like, well, that's a no-brainer then. Why wouldn't I want the best? Why would I settle for second or third if I can have the best? So that was the beginning of our journey. So here, and again, I apologize in advance because there's so much we could talk about. We're just going to be brushing the surface. But again, hopefully it can inspire you, and I can try to point you to resources to help you in this. But it all starts with the soil. You know, if you come to me with a gardening question, probably the first thing I'm going to ask you is, how's your soil? And if you say, I don't know, then you need to find out. What's your soil like? Do you know, have you had a soil sample? Do you know what the nutrient levels are in your soil? If you don't know, then I don't know what to tell you. I mean, I can tell you some general things, but the soil in the Bible, the soil, it equals what? The heart. The soil is the heart. As a man thinketh in his heart, so is he, right? So this is the very foundation of agriculture, literally. Just as it's the very foundation of spirituality, the heart. In the parable of the sower, the good ground was the ground with no rocks, no weeds, It was loose and fertile, right? So those are things we don't want in good soil. So we know just from that parable, if our ground is hard like the wayside, we need to loosen it. If it's thorny, we need to get the thorns out. If it's rocky, stony ground, we need to remove the stones, right? To have good ground. I like to think of compost as grace. Grace is free. Compost can be free. I mean, you can make it yourself. It doesn't cost you anything except a little sweat, but it really doesn't even need to cost you that, because you make a pile of kitchen scraps and they're going to compost sooner or later. Grace is a wonderful thing. It makes a garden come alive, makes our hearts come alive. And then I liken soil testing for mineral content to equal the law. What I found, my personal experience, is that I learned when I started in 1998, we didn't even have access to the internet. And there just wasn't much information out there. So we were learning through trial and error. But the one book I had, which is still an excellent book, but it really focused on compost. You know, to an organic gardener, compost is like everything, black gold, you know, they call it. And so I was just pouring on the compost. But, you know, I thought it was supposed to fix all my problems, and it wasn't. I was still having disease issues, and I was still having insect issues, and I'm thinking, wait a minute. Why, you know, after 10 years of growing, why am I not past all this? And then I started understanding more about soil balancing and testing the soil, and realizing that grace without the law can get out of balance, right? We see a lot of examples of this in the world, what we might term cheap grace. You know, it's a grace that wants to be apart from the law, above the law. But the law is there to give us a stable foundation. And so I would strongly encourage you to think about soil testing. And there are a lot of different methods out there for soil testing, and I don't have time to go into them all, and I don't even understand them all, to be totally honest with you. But what I can say is all the people that I know and respect, their knowledge in the area of soil, what they call agronomy, the study of soils, they encourage the Albrecht method of soil testing. And that is the main modern proponent of that is Neil Kinsey. And I've got his information up here. You can send your soil tests to him, or what I really recommend, Whitmar McConnell. How many of you have heard of Whitmar McConnell? Okay, a number of you. He is an Adventist soil consultant, and actually he does all our soil consulting. Even though I've done it a lot of years, I would rather have somebody who knows more than me telling me this is what you need to put on your soils every year. So we test all our different plots every year, or at least that's our goal, and send them off, and he tells us, okay, this is what you need to do here, and this is what you need to do here.
You test each year, each plot?
Yes, that's the goal. Now, I will say, I would not necessarily say that a home gardener needs to do that. You have to remember, we're trying to earn a living from this, and we are growing very intensively. You know, many of our plots have 5 to 6 different crops on them every year. So when you're growing that intensively, you've really got to stay on top of your soil. You know, you're taking a lot from it. And this is a principle I want you to understand. This country was settled by people who were taking from the soil and not giving it back. If you remember your history of the move west, why were they moving west? Because they were wearing out their soils by taking and not giving back. And so it's a biblical principle, it's the law of life, service, right? Giving. If you're not giving more to the soil than you're taking out of it, then your soil is going to become depleted and not give in return. So it's extremely important that you're adding all the time to your soil. So I would encourage you to get in touch with Whitmar, and he can send you directions on how to take a soil sample. We don't have time to go into it more deeply than that at this point. Okay, number 2, use silage tarps. How many of you have heard of silage tarps? Okay, we've got Chris here who works at Farmer's Friend, a company my son started, which is, I think you've seen a few silage tarps. They send out hundreds every year. Thousands probably is more accurate. This is the closest thing that I have ever found to no work gardening. And I say the closest because there is no such thing as no work gardening. In fact, I would encourage you, if you're trying to take the sweat out of the gardening, you're actually trying to short circuit God's plan for man. Because that sweat of the brow is actually part of God's plan of redeeming us. So don't try to take the sweat out of it. But the reality is it's hard no matter how you do it. But these silage tarps are so amazing because what it is, well, let me just put that. I'm sorry, this is kind of small. I'm sure a lot of you're welcome to move up. There's room up front here. But it's heavy duty, 5mm or thicker UV resistant polyethylene. The key is the UV resistant part. If you just go down to the local hardware store and buy black plastic, chances are it's not UV resistant and it's going to break down very quickly. These silage tarps will last for years. So what you do is you get the silage tarp, then you cut down the weeds. Whatever's growing there, if it's pasture or something, just mow it down close. You don't want tall stuff. Water it well, and then lay out the tarps. Figure out how big you want your garden space. And this is ideally done now in the fall. Just lay out that tarp, and then you're going to have to weight it down with sandbags or something, rocks or blocks or something, because you get some wind and that thing likes to fly. So just weight it down good and just wait. Wait on the Lord. And the biology in the soil starts going to work because there's all that dead stuff on the surface. The black plastic especially when it's still hot out. You know, as we get into winter, it doesn't work quite so well, but the black plastic will fairly quickly kill anything that's still growing under there. And then it creates this seemingly perfect environment for the earthworms and all the biology in the soil, because it's dark, it's moist, and it's warm. And that's what these things love. The first time I saw this demonstrated was J.M. Fortier. Some of you may have heard of him or seen his book, The Market Gardener. We were visiting his farm up in Quebec, and he pulled back this silage tarp, and I was in awe, because there were these huge earthworms just all over the surface of the ground. It's like, wow. I mean, they were obviously very healthy earthworms. And the soil was just so rich and loose and loamy. It was incredible. So I said, man, we're getting some of these. And it really has largely transformed the way we do our gardening now. And I will say, I will caution you that the downside to silage tarp is it's not adding anything to your soil. And as I just said, you know, we want to be constantly giving to the soil. So I do believe these can probably be overused. I put one on for a whole year once when we had a sabbatical just a couple years ago. And what I found after that time, well, what I can say is it really did a good number on the weeds. But that soil was not as fertile afterwards. For a whole year it hadn't fed anything. But the other thing I wanted to just say about the silage tarps, not only does it create this perfect environment for the biology in the soil, but it also creates a perfect environment for weeds to sprout. You know, it's moist and it's warm and dark. So you get all these weeds that are close to the surface that sprout, but they can't grow because there's no light. Plants can't grow without light. So they may struggle along for a while. If you pull the tarp back, you'll see all these white, stringy little weeds, but they're going to succumb very quickly. So you're depleting your weed population as well. So it's quite amazing. Wait for 3 or 4 weeks. I would say that's kind of ideal minimum. The more organic matter that was there beforehand, you know, if you've got tall, big stuff, it's not going to be totally broken down in 4 weeks, depending on your earthworm population. But it will definitely be greatly reduced, and what is there can just be raked off because the roots will have broken down. So you can just rake off whatever's there and put it on the compost pile or something.
Should we add earthworms? Would that help?
It's certainly not going to hurt adding earthworms. Yeah, I mean, I've never done that, so I can't, but I would think that would be a good thing. The question, you know, what I know of buying earthworms is that they're a special kind of earthworm that they buy for what's called vermicomposting, and it's not the same as what is normally in the soil. So when you pull that tarp back, you're going to have this loose, weed-free, ready-to-work soil. Here's a picture that, I mean, it's just incredible. It's moist, crummy. That's what you're wanting, a really crummy soil. crummy in a good way. I like to liken it to a moist carob cake or chocolate cake. You know, that's the look you want of your soil. Okay, so that's number 2. So let's go on to number 3. Grow in beds, not rows. Rows were developed way back when people were cultivating with animals. And if you're going to cultivate with animals, you need long rows, or that's ideal. And then, of course, tractors came in, and tractors also, you need to be able to grow in rows, and then you have cultivators that go along on each side of it. But it's not the most efficient way to use your garden space. And a big part of it is compaction. If you're just growing in rows, you're going to be walking very close to the plants, and you're going to be compacting the soil, which is not what you want. The roots need a loose, aerated soil in order to stay healthy. But more than that, it's a more efficient use of space. You know, if you figure out how many plants you can get in a single row as compared to a bed, you can fit a lot more in a bed. So we talked about there's less compaction, there's less weeding and cultivation. If you think about it, if you're growing in rows, you have, depending on how far your rows are apart, you've got a lot of bare ground there that isn't producing anything for you except more work, because you're having to cultivate that all. Whereas if you're growing in beds, you grow at a more intensive spacing where quickly the plants shade out the soil and keep the weeds from really growing well. And then all you're cultivating is the aisles, and you keep those small. We strongly recommend 30-inch wide beds and 12 to 18-inch wide pathways, depending on your space. For us in our hoop houses, we have 12-inch pathways because that's valuable space, and we don't want to waste it. So, but 12-inch pathways, you got to be careful how you walk and how you squat and everything. Otherwise, you're going to be getting into the beds on either side. So 15, even 18-inch pathways are probably a little more comfortable for most people. But again, you know, the wider you go, the pathway is just that. It's a pathway that you're going to have to cultivate or something. So don't go wider than you need to. And the beds are kind of like the church. It's a symbiotic relationship to strengthen and encourage each other. Those plants, as they're closer together in the beds, actually help each other. You know, there's a lot going on under the ground with the root systems and everything that science is still just beginning to understand. Okay, that's number 3, grow in beds, not rows. Number 4, use a broad fork. Now, this is a tool we're going to demonstrate a little later, so I'm not going to say a whole lot about it now. But I will just say I believe this equates to Mrs. White's encouragement to plow deep. You know, I always get asked that question, and I'm not saying I have the definitive answer on it, but, you know, when I say we don't plow and we don't even use a rototiller, you know, people, well, but what about Mrs. White's counsel to plow often and plow deep? Well, my personal opinion is she was using the terminology of the day, and that's what they had at the time, was a plow. But there's a lot of research that would tell you that a plow is not the best tool for the soil. It's very unnatural and very disturbing to the soil because it's flipping the soil over completely. So my take, and again, I could be wrong, but this is the way I have seen it, is that what she was really saying is the soil needs to be worked deeply. And I believe that the Broad Fork accomplishes that purpose with very little disturbance of the soil as far as turning over. So it's much better for the biology of the soil. And I have seen with my own eyes, and it's hard to argue with truth in front of you, that a soil that is overworked, whether it's with a plow or a rototiller or anything else, degrades very quickly. Whereas a soil that is left largely to the natural biology of the soil to replenish itself is so much nicer to work with. Yes.
So your goal is really just to get air in there.
Exactly. Your goal is to aerate the soil, keep it from getting too compacted without disturbing it more than necessary. By the way, this Kendra up here has been interning on our farm for the last 7 months, so don't be afraid to ask her questions. It's good for her to answer them because it helps solidify them in her own mind. But she has a lot of knowledge now about these things. So the Broad Fork doesn't turn the soil over, and it keeps the soil well aerated. And I believe it fits with Jeremiah 4 verse 3, which counsels us to break up our fallow ground. So here's a picture, but again, we'll try to demonstrate this, so we will just move on. Oh, I do want to speak for a minute about rototilling, because I think most home gardeners feel that they have to have a rototiller in order to be successful, and I would actually discourage you from getting a rototiller. There are a lot of other tools that I think would be a better use of money that will leave your soil in a lot better shape. So just quickly, I don't want to belabor the point, but we talked about how the ideal soil is that moist, crummy chocolate cake, carob cake kind of consistency. If you were to dry that, you'd have to put it in the dehydrator so it really dries out, and then put it in a blender. What are you going to have? You're going to have a powder. So could we liken the rototiller to a blender? Instead of turning this way, it's just turning this way. So what the rototiller is doing is turning that crumb structure, not to say what it's doing to all the worms and everything, but it's turning it into a powder. And what's a powder going to do? It's going to erode either through wind erosion or water erosion, or the other thing it's going to do is crust. It's going to form a hard crust. So what do you do? What does the normal gardener do when his soil crusts over? He rototills again, because he loves to see, or she loves to see, that loose, fluffy soil. And so you're burning up any organic matter that's in the soil. you're destroying the soil structure. And like I say, I would love to see everybody sell their rototillers and buy a broad fork and maybe a few other hand tools I could point you to. And that may seem like more work at first, but I can promise you, if you will take care of your soil, the job gets easier and easier, right? Okay, so enough on that. Number 5, cultivate, don't weed. Do you know what the difference is? Weeding is usually handwork on your hands and knees, and it's very laborious. And basically, in market gardening, we say if you have to get down on your hands and knees, you've just lost any profit that you were going to make on that crop. So, you know, we want to be down on our hands and knees for some things, right? For praying and other things like that. And I, to be honest with you, I love weeding. It's one of my favorite things to do. But it's not profitable. And so you want to stay standing up as much as possible. So weeding is when the weeds are big. And so you're either hand weeding, pulling by hand, or you're with a hoe chopping and sweating and, oh, my aching back. Cultivating is getting rid of weeds ideally before you even see them. You know they're there, right? You can't ever get rid of them completely. Now, if you're faithful with cultivation, every year you'll have less and less weeds. But you're never going to get rid of them completely because they blow in. The birds bring them in. You track them in on your shoes. You're always going to have weeds. But if you get them small, and ideally, like I say, before you even see them sprouting, but if you wait till they're an inch tall, it's really, I wouldn't say it's too late, because you can still get them, but it's way past the ideal time. You want to get them when they're barely visible at all. And then it's very simple. And again, I won't take time to demonstrate now because Kendra will show you how to use these tools in the garden. But cultivation can actually be a joy, whereas weeding for most people is a chore. So it's as one writer says, and I wish I could remember the quote exactly, but one man can cultivate what it takes 7 men to do weeding. So you've heard the saying, little attention's often repeated. That's exactly what we have here. Just set a time each week and cultivate. Get rid of weeds before they're even visible. And again, you know, what do weeds represent in the Bible? Sin. Do we want to wait for sin to fully develop in our hearts? The reality is, when sin fully develops, many times it's never gotten rid of. It's too hard. And by that time, addictions have been formed and you're struggling. It's a battle for life. But if you nip it in the bud, it's really not that hard. Okay, I'm not supposed to eat that? No problem. Because you're not used to it. But, you know, I don't know if any of you have had addictions to anything. I mean, even coffee. You know, a lot of people have a hard time giving up coffee because their body has begun to crave it and thinks it needs it. Don't let that happen in the garden. So some tools that we will demonstrate: the collinear hoe. Have you heard of the collinear hoe? Oh, you all are in for a treat. I love to share these tools with people because just having the right tool for the job can make a world of difference. What about a stirrup hoe? Probably some of you have seen a stirrup hoe because they have cheap versions of it at most hardware stores, or a hula hoe, they're sometimes called. The wheel hoe. You want to really get high-tech. I mean, forget the rototiller, get a wheel hoe. It's great. And all these tools are available from Johnny's Selected Seeds, johnnyseeds.com. I'll warn you, they're not cheap because most of them are Swiss made. So we're talking about, yes. Sorry, let's see here. Johnny's Selected Seeds. They are a good source of seeds as well as tools. But like I say, they're not cheap tools, but if they're taken care of properly, they'll last you a lifetime. So again, how much does a rototiller cost? I mean, I don't really know. If you bought it new, I'm sure it's probably $400 or $500, right? Depending on how big. And then you've got the ongoing maintenance costs. If fuel, oil, and if you're not a small engine mechanic, chances are every spring your carburetor is going to be clogged because you're using ethanol gas, which is a big no-no in small engines. So you got to take it to the shop and get the carburetor cleaned and all of that. And it's noisy, and it's hard on your body. Why not just be out there with a hand tool that you can hear the birds singing and you can commune with the Lord while you're...
But if you have like virgin land that's full of roots and...
Okay, if you have virgin land full of roots and ...
Yeah. Because my plan was to get a tiller and curtail.
Yeah, I would still discourage the tiller. I would, if you've got like tree roots, you're going to need a tractor in there. You can hire a tractor to come in, and it may mean if they only have a plow, that's what you end up doing the first time. But get it plowed, or maybe, worst case scenario, they have a tractor tiller. But, yeah, I just don't like tillers. I've seen what they do. But I'm trying to think what else. There's a chisel plow, which is a little less disturbing to the soil. But even a moldboard plow, if you're just doing it the first time, just moldboard plow, that's a standard turning plow. Sometimes you have to take one step back to go 2 steps forward. And if that's what's available, then that's what you use. So get it plowed, then put your tarp down and let it mellow for a while. And come spring, you'll have some nice soil. Yes, and let's see, where are we? I want to make sure we get to your questions, but I think we're good actually on time. So let's have a few questions.
Okay, so my question is, how long would it take, because I went into my woods and got soil to fill my garden bed, and so I did the tiller, but I don't plan to do any tilling now, but how long would it take to get that soil where it's like a carrot cake?
So you went into the woods and got leaves and I mean, did you get leaves or you? Okay, and so you actually got the good stuff. Good. Well, that's a lot of work. Yeah. Yeah, that's good.
But I'm wondering, like,
I mean, that is soil. That's,
yeah. But I did till it just to like loosen it up to get it in my wheelbarrow.
okay.
For the garden.
Uh-huh.
I'm wondering, like, if there's like a process that it can go through to return to a good.
Well, you just leaving it, letting the biology of the soil repopulate, and yeah, it will happen. Adding organic matter. I'll tell you one thing, another little tip here that I don't think I cover here. Again, there's just no way to cover it all, but I think the quickest way to get poor soil into good shape is using peat moss. I'm a big believer in peat moss. And I know there are those people who think that peat moss is not being environmentally responsible. But my own study of the situation is that the peat, most of Canada is peat. Or I should say, I don't know about most, but much of Canada is peat. There's huge peat deposits up there. And what I have seen is that it's being replenished faster than it's being harvested. So in my mind, that makes it pretty sustainable. Now, of course, it does have to be shipped down from Canada. But anyway, whether you have sandy soil or a high clay soil, adding peat moss does amazing things to loosen that soil up and hold in moisture. And the beauty of peat moss as compared to compost, you can also buy compost. But unless you really know what you're doing, you might end up with some really cheap compost that's actually doing your soil more harm than good. So I would, and then there's whole other issues with stuff being sprayed on whatever ends up getting composted, like hay fields and stuff. There are certain sprays, certain herbicides that don't break down in the composting process and will actually kill your garden plants. So I would just be very cautious about buying compost. Of course, making your own is a whole nother thing that I would encourage, and it's not hard. But peat moss, well, and so one other thing with compost, many composts are manure-based, and if you're not careful, you can really throw some of your nutrient levels out of whack. You can get too much phosphorus in your soil from the manures and so on. So you have to be careful. You can think you're helping your soil when in fact you're actually taking steps backwards by bringing in compost. Whereas peat moss is virtually neutral fertility-wise. It has very little fertility, but it's high carbon organic matter, so it's going to stay in the soil longer. And I've seen it in our own soils, how much it does. And right now, I'm hoping we can cut back at some point, but right now we're putting on a bale, the compressed bales you can buy of peat moss. We put on one bale per 50 feet of bed. So we're buying pallet loads of peat moss and putting it on, and I say it's worth every penny of it. We spend thousands of dollars on peat moss. So I don't know, did I answer your question? I kind of got a little off.
One more question. The peat moss, isn't it more on the aesthetic side? So But then he was like, well, can we really add peat moss? And then we wouldn't really be like balancing like that. So,
Yeah, I don't know. Do I need to repeat the questions? Okay, I don't know where this is going, but anyway, yeah, the question is about the acidity of peat moss. Yes, peat moss is on the acidic side, but I personally have not seen a major issue. You know, and I will say this, for years and years, we made our own potting mix, which is, you know, half peat moss. And we never added lime or anything to it, and it was never an issue. So I personally think that this acidity thing, even like with leaves and stuff, they talk about you got to be careful because it's acidic. From my personal experience, and again, I'm not an expert, but I think it's a little overblown. That's my personal opinion. Okay. Oh, here's just some pictures of a collinear hoe and a stirrup hoe and a wheel hoe. Unfortunately, I don't have a wheel hoe to show you. I wish I did, but it's too big to put in our vehicle to bring down here. So we will demonstrate the other two hoes. Yes, sir. What are my thoughts about Jacob Mittleiter's method? To be totally honest with you, I've never read his books. I don't have access to his books. So I don't want to say too much. I can say that I went to Russia years ago and saw a garden where he had consulted, and I was a little shocked at what they were doing. But again, that's coming from my perspective. And it was so unorthodox to me that I mean, they were growing basically in sawdust, and yeah, that goes against what I know. But I don't want to say any more on that because I can't really speak to it unless I've studied it more. I guess what I would say is that made me not really interested in studying it too much. But again, I don't, there may be good things that I don't know about, and maybe those people in Russia were not following it the way he wanted it to be followed. So I don't want to put it down in any way. Okay, number 6, cover the soil. Don't leave it bare. Again, this is kind of, gardeners love to have this bare dirt, right? Just their rows of plants and everything else, just beautiful brown fluffy soil. But it doesn't stay that way. Nakedness is a result of sin, right? Naked soil is a result of sin. And all of nature will fight against you if you leave your soil naked. Have you noticed that? What does nature try to do to bare soil? Tries to cover it, and you go through this whole succession of your annual weeds and then your perennial weeds and then on and on. Naked soil is not healthy and it's not natural, and so nature is going to try to clothe itself. So you're fighting against nature, so rather than fight it, why don't you work with it? So there's a lot of things you can do. Use cover crops. Organic mulches like straw or leaves or hay. Non-organic mulches like plastic. Silage tarps. Undersowing. This is one that I want to learn more about. We do on some level, but you plant your cash crop or the crop you're growing for yourself, and then when it gets so big, you undersow a cover crop like clover or something, so you're getting your cake and eating it too, kind of thing. If you time it right and if you get the right combinations, it's really amazing. Like the one that works really well for us is in the fall. We always do brassicas, all your broccoli and cabbage and all of that. And so about a month after planting, the plants are so big, I go in there and I broadcast crimson clover. And the crimson clover comes up, makes this nice carpet so you're not working in the mud. So the key is we cultivate ideally 2 or 3 times in that month after you've planted, but before you sow the clover, so you get rid of the vast majority of your weed population, and then you sow an intentional weed, so to speak, and cover the ground with that clover, and the clover just stays small in the fall until you're finished harvesting the broccoli and Brussels sprouts and everything by Christmas time at the latest usually, and then all those plants are just going to slowly die over the rest of the winter. And come springtime, you've got this beautiful field of crimson clover that's just amazing. And it's fixing nitrogen in the soil. So you mow that down, put your tarp down, let it sit for a few weeks, and you're ready to go. It's really great. And then biointensive plant spacing, like I said, in your beds, you're planting the plants close enough that as they grow, they're going to start shading the soil and keeping the weeds down, as well as, just creating a good environment in the soil for all the biology. So, again, there's a lot I could say about each of these, but I think we'll leave it there for now. Let's go on to the last one. Use season extension techniques. Do you all know what this is here? Can you see that? Somebody's hand is behind it. What's that called? Anybody know? It's Chris. Floating row cover. It's actually the very same material that is used as dryer sheets in your dryer, or the thicker floating row covers are your baby wipes, Same stuff, just without the scent and a lot bigger. Okay, that's what floating row cover is. It's the cheapest and simplest way to extend your season. As my wife was saying this morning, we want to encourage everybody to be growing year-round. It's actually amazingly easy to do anywhere in the country. Kendra is from northern Idaho, up near the Canadian border. She can grow in the winter up there because we know that because there's farms up there doing it successfully. And we're talking about growing with no heat. We're not talking about fancy high-tech greenhouses. We're talking about simple techniques that are relatively cheap. And especially here, you can grow probably just with floating row cover. So this floating row cover is like I say, the cheapest way to go, but it does involve some hassle factor because you have to anchor it down with sandbags, and you got to take those off and to get under there. There are various forms of unheated structures, you know, from low tunnels up to caterpillar tunnels and even high tunnels or greenhouses. A book I would highly recommend for if you're wanting to grow in the winter is Elliot Coleman's The Winter Harvest Handbook. He was the pioneer in this. Again, he's in Maine, Zone 5. I'm guessing here you're at least Zone 8. So if he can do it, you can do it. The Winter Harvest Handbook is specifically, I mean, it's geared for market growers. So if you're just a home grower, some of the information is going to be kind of, you know, more than you need to know, but a lot of it will be very helpful. Wants life and vitality all the time, not just in the good times. It's amazing to eat fresh salads out of your garden all winter long. It's actually really amazing. And if you think about it this way, you can, if you just eat with the seasons, it can really simplify things because you don't have to preserve as much. Canning is good, but it's a lot of work. And so, you know, you eat tomatoes in the summer and eat greens in the winter, you know. I think my opinion is that God actually created, or I guess maybe he didn't create us because we didn't have winter in the Garden of Eden, but he has helped mankind to adapt to where they live. And if we eat what naturally grows where we live in the seasons that it grows in, then I think that's a good thing. Okay, so we're wrapping it up here. Here's just a picture of a low tunnel, just with simple wire hoops covering a bed. So let's end with this quote. This is a promise. This is encouraging from 6T 178. If the land is cultivated, it will, with the blessing of God, supply our necessities. Is that a promise? So we need the blessing of God, but we also need to cultivate it. It doesn't happen without our part. We are not to be discouraged about temporal things because of apparent failures, nor should we be disheartened by delay. We should work the soil cheerfully, hopefully, gratefully, believing that the earth holds in her bosom rich stores for the faithful worker to garner, stores richer than gold or silver. The niggardliness laid to her charge is false witness. With proper intelligent cultivation, the earth will yield its treasures for the benefit of man. It will yield them with intelligent cultivation. We have to be smart about it. The mountains and hills are changing. The earth is waxing old like a garment. But the blessing of God, which spreads a table for his people in the wilderness, will never cease. So that's a beautiful promise that we like to claim. Yes, it's getting harder. You know, wow, we had some challenges this year. Goldfinches, you know, pretty little goldfinches. What harm could they do? I'll tell you what, they did a lot of harm in our garden this fall. that we've learned that they're called salad birds. And they love especially the Chenopodiaceae family. That's your beets and your Swiss chard and your spinach. When the plants are little, they'll just pluck them out. And when they get bigger, the Swiss chard, they'll just peck holes in the leaves. So, you know, we never had that problem till last year. That was the first time we dealt with it. So it's just getting more and more challenging. But the blessing of God will never cease. Okay, well, that's enough of that. It's almost 12 o'clock. Lunch is at 1, right? So, are there a few more questions? And then we'll break and head to the garden. Yes?
What do you use to create the hoop to keep it secure?
Okay, what do you use to create the hoop? Are you talking about small hoops or big hoops?
The small hoop that goes over with the rope.
The picture that I just showed you, it's a, I forget the number, it's a heavy gauge wire, and you can buy them already formed and ready to use. They're relatively cheap. I forget the number of the grade. I think maybe it's number 9 wire or something. I don't know. But anyway, it's just wire. Yeah.
Do you have an address to get the supplies at an economical cost? And then also on the cover, last year, you used sandbags. Well, if you take clothes hangers, the wire clothes hangers, and cut them about that length there, you can bend it and use those. That's what I used. It was much cheaper. You can get the hooks pushed down.
Staples, ground staples. Yeah.
But you can also use the wire clothes hangers. They work well. But what can you get the covers more economically?
Okay, so the question is about where to find supplies. And that's a good question because, you know, it depends on where you live in the country. Obviously, the closer you are to where it's coming from, the less you're going to pay for shipping, or ideally you can go pick it up yourself. So I've got a good supplier up in Kentucky, but that's a ways from here. It's about 2 hours north of us. We live in Middle Tennessee. So what I can tell you, I will work with Kimberly on this. I do have a resource list. And again, because this was kind of put together at the last minute, I don't have it printed out, but we will see if we can get that printed out. It includes books and sources for supplies. Yes? Is there any hope for rocky, sandy soil? Yes, there's hope for any soil. Now, if you're talking about solid rock, there's a difference between rocky soil and solid rock. If you're on bedrock, then yes, really the only thing you can do other than dynamiting would be to use some sort of raised bed. But if it's just a matter of rocks, how many children do you have? Okay, just make some incentives. Children, for every 100 rocks you get out, are they little rocks or big rock? Yeah, just start. I mean, you don't have to have rock-free soil to start. Now, your goal is rock-free soil, but that may take you a while to get there because rocks seem to appear, they seem to grow. It feels like they grow. And there's actually some truth to that. If you're in an area that freezes and thaws a lot, it can actually push rocks up. But probably more likely the reality is that you're losing topsoil. And so that way it can seem like they're growing because your soil is eroding away. So anyway, the beauty of this kind of gardening is, yeah, any soil can be made productive. That's the beauty of the gospel, right? And gardening is just the gospel illustrated.
But you would have to add peat moss to help with the sand?
Yeah, if I had a really sandy soil, I would be really focused on organic matter, starting with peat moss. Compost, I'd be trying to make all the compost I could. We should talk for just a couple minutes about compost, because I find a lot of home gardeners end up with this stinky, smelly mess.
Yes.
Have you been there? Okay, it's so simple, so simple. There's just think of compost source material in two categories: browns and greens. The browns are your high carbon sources, so that would be things like straw, leaves, dead corn stalks, dead grass, anything that's brown, basically. That's your high carbon, and you always need more carbon than nitrogen, because your greens are your moist, green, mushy stuff. And if you have a stinky, smelly compost pile, it's because you've got too much greens and not enough browns. The simplest way is to go to your local co-op or feed store or something, buy a bale of straw. And every time you can actually go out there and redo your smelly pile, just put a little of the smelly stuff. Well, start with a layer of straw, put a little smelly stuff on, put another layer of straw, and remake it that way. And then from then on, as you empty your kitchen scraps, those are going to be high greens, really high greens. You just have to be adding lots of browns. And again, that can be old tomato vines that are dead, it can be your corn stalks, whatever. Chop them up some. The finer they're chopped, the quicker they're going to break down. But just alternate. And, the other thing that can be an issue, but it won't be an issue, that'll solve your problem. I can 98% guarantee it. You can have an issue if your pile also stays super soggy. So if it's where it's getting a lot of rain, you want to cover it. You want it to be moist, like they say, like a wrung out sponge. But if it's dripping water, it's too wet and it's going to go anaerobic. If it's too dry and you have too much browns, it's going to just kind of sit there. So it's just simple. If you understand those basics, if it's stinky and smelly and ooey, you need to add browns. If it's just dry and sitting there not doing anything, you may need to add a little bit of greens or some high nitrogen source. You can poke some holes and pour molasses in or something like that. Simple, and it'll solve your problems. Yeah, good question. So she's saying, what do you do? When can you use it if you keep adding new stuff? So basically, at some point, you're going to want to start a new pile. What we do, we have a super simple method of composting. 1 year, we build a pile. The next year, it's one of the first things the interns do. They move that pile, they just fork it over to the next place, and then start a new pile. The third year, they fork that second pile over to a third spot, and it's ready to go. And then fork the new pile from last year to the second place. And so we have 3 piles. 3 years, or after 2 years, it's ready to go. Super simple. We just cover it with actually with an old silage tarp, and that's all we do. And yes.
2 quick questions. You mentioned a bale of peat moss for 50-foot row. Is that 50 foot and then 50 foot and 50 like this? Or
No.
And then how wide?
Okay, so we use 30-inch beds. So that's 30 inches by 50 feet. So that's, what is that, 125 square feet? 2.5 times 50. Yeah.
It's a bale for one of those.
Yeah, that's what we do. You know, if your soil is really high clay, or I guess probably high sand, you could go up with that. You know, it's basically what you can afford. I think it would be hard to put too much. You could put too much, but most people wouldn't.
My next question is, do you ever use wood chips in the beds
Do we ever use wood chips in the bed?
and fresh or dried out?
No, we do not use wood chips in the bed. And I know there's a very popular Back to Eden video out there that a lot of people have seen. Wood chips are super high carbon, and carbon is going to tie up the nitrogen. And so, especially if they're fresh, they're going to tie up your nitrogen, and your crops are going to be nitrogen starved unless you add a lot of extra nitrogen. Obviously, when wood chips finally break down completely, then that's soil. You know, that's beautiful. But we use wood chips as a mulch in our perennial plantings, like basically our blueberries, and that works very well. Blueberries love that. We actually even use it on our asparagus, which is kind of interesting because asparagus likes a high pH, and wood chips, as I said, would tend to lower your pH, but it seems to be working. I don't know. So that's what we save wood chips for. Okay, I think we should get some fresh air, and we'll be around to answer questions, but we'll just go over here down the grass pathway in the garden, and we'll just demonstrate some tools.